Early 1964 was a time of both transition and difficulty in the United States. Americans were still accepting the death of President John F. Kennedy, while the country was torn over the ever-intensifying civil rights movement. America was shaken and hurting, and in search of a new sensation. It was at this time that a young, aspiring group of boys from Liverpool arrived on the American music scene. They did so with groundbreaking results, beginning a new era. The Beatles became the first British rock group to establish a name for themselves in America, and began a rise to success that caused swarms of British musicians to take over American music culture in the phenomenon known as the British Invasion. And the influence of the Beatles and the British Invasion are still evident in American music culture today.
By the time of John F. Kennedy's death, the Beatles had already established themselves in the UK as a reputable band. Consisting of Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and George Harrison, the very young but talented group had already set out on a tour in the UK. At this point, they had already released several records in the UK, and as they continued to gain traction, word began to spread to members of the music industry in the United States, especially American promoter Sid Bernstein. Before this point, the Beatles had not yet established a name for themselves in the public eye in America. According to Bruce Spitzer, a Beatles author and historian, the Beatles were contacted to play a show scheduled on February 12, 1963. However, the Beatles were not yet willing to come to the US unless they had a #1 hit. So they hit the studios, and as they did, they were booked to perform on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th in America. A week before they arrived, their single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, rocketed to the top of the American charts. The Beatles were extensively publicized weeks before their arrival and became almost an instant phenomenon in the US, propelled by their debut on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was viewed by millions. This is original footage of the Beatles performing I Want to Hold Your Hand on the Ed Sullivan Show during their first visit to the US.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something, I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand, I wanna hold your hand, I wanna hold your hand. It's been a hard day.
The profound success the Beatles experienced in the United States was historically unparalleled in the music industry. Word of the Beatles' success quickly spread back to the UK, and American promoters were more than willing to book any British music group that wanted a taste of success. And in light of the Beatles' success, they were all willing, says Frank Hoffman in his survey of American music. And thus, the British invasion began. Within weeks of the Beatles propelling into the spotlight, British bands began to dominate the charts, leaving little room for the folk groups that were widely listened to prior to the Fab Four's self-proclaimed invasion. As a result of the Beatles, the 60s became a decade defined by British rock and roll, with groups such as the Rolling Stones, Cream, The Who, and Led Zeppelin, to name only a few. The Beatles not only led groups of their time to success in America, but also had significant influence on a future generation of musicians who would later rise to fame in America. The Beatles established a fresh stream of talent flowing into the United States for decades. The Beatles essentially reinvented American culture as they built their reputation not only as musicians, but as icons. Their fashion, hairstyle, and culture were all quickly popularized by the youth of America. Stephen Stark, a Beatles author and historian, says that, in a country in which popular culture is extremely important, there's probably nobody more important than the Beatles. The sheer magnitude of attention the Beatles received off the bat is almost unrivaled throughout American music history. An article published by CBS states that over 73 million Americans watched the Beatles' first performance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Over 40% of the American population viewed this legendary performance, a higher percentage audience than any Super Bowl to date. To say the Beatles were huge would be an understatement. Despite the wave of British groups that swarmed into America, the success experienced by the Beatles was, and still is, unrivaled. In an article published on the Beatles in Time magazine in 1964, author Gail Cameron says, "The Beatles have done more to expand British influence around the world more than anybody since Queen Victoria and maybe even Sir Francis Drake." Nobody expected the Beatles to revitalize rock and roll in America. Soon, American musicians found themselves scratching their heads asking, what happened? Cultural change happened. Cultural geographer Kenneth Olwig writes that American folk musicians saw a coming folk revival before the Beatles came to fame. However, many British bands continued to pour out more rock hits. American folk musicians decided to be more rock-oriented. Artists such as Bob Dylan and Jerry Garcia both adapted new sounds and created a successful career. Folk musicians changed their sound to accommodate the rock-driven industry that was established by the British invasion. Not only did the Beatles influence American culture by introducing British music, but they influenced their American counterparts. Bob Dylan and Jerry Garcia do not even begin to brush the surface with the mass of artists who have been influenced by the Beatles. The impact of the Beatles on the music industry is unrivaled, not just in the United Kingdom or America, but globally. The Beatles established what is now considered to be the standard rock band, consisting of guitar, bass, and drums. The band constructed the building blocks of contemporary rock. In the past 50 years since their debut, the Beatles have been one of the heaviest influences on artists and bands. Musician and writer Bill McGarvey identifies U2, Oasis, Nirvana, Arcade Fire, Radiohead, Sex Pistols, and Coldplay as only a small number of artists taking heavy influence of the Beatles' style. Tom Petty is quoted saying, "The Beatles were the North Star for me and my generation."
Hey Jude.
Ultimately, with the Beatles, their reputation and legacy precede them. It is widely accepted that the Beatles are one of, if not the greatest band in the history of popular music, and few other musicians will argue it. Their records released in their 8 years together as a band are some of the greatest works of songwriting the world has ever seen. More covers have been done of Beatles songs than those of any other artist. The band received 10 Grammys and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1984. George, Paul, John, and Ringo were also each inducted as solo artists later on. Beatles music is still widely listened to today and stands its ground against modern music. This is no small feat in a music industry filled with one-hit wonders and new hits every week. The Beatles spent more time at number 1 on the charts than any other band. They established fame and status that will long surpass the lives of the living members. Musicians who were not yet even born during the Beatles' time together as a band consider the Beatles to be one of their largest influences.
What would the world look like without the Beatles? Surely, the music industry would be completely different. The young and talented boys who stepped off Pan Am Flight 101 to New York had no idea that they were about to change pop culture forever. They had no idea that for decades to come, they would be revered as the creators of rock and roll as it is now. How would they have guessed that they would inspire hundreds of musicians of their time to follow in their footsteps and reshape culture in America and shape the definitive decade of the second half of the century? Or that they would influence artists around the world for over 50 years. The Beatles have said themselves that they had no idea what they were getting into when they first came to America, but surely none of them regret it. They became leaders of their time without holding any political office or having any official authority. Rather, they spoke to the hearts of people around the world and possessed the talent to bring about change and write the most rich, diverse, brilliant discography the world has ever seen. And when that day comes that the Beatles are no longer revered as the greatest band in the history of rock and roll, surely those who replace them will have been inspired by that brilliant, youthful Fab Four.
Because